What's up, everyone? It's the Autistic Scyther here, and new year, new crop of countdowns. Yeah, that being said, considering how last year was kind of my first half a year involving in my channel, it kind of makes some sense that I basically make a brand. I'm going to essentially focus on my countdowns this year. Granted, like I said, I will add some new stuff, but watch the video to see which one, to see everything that the entire roadmap that I basically laid out. Now, back to my countdown. Let's talk about guilty pleasure. I mean, I, like many others, have many things that are guilty pleasure. But when it comes down to it, and when it comes to anime, I've seen a lot of anime that I'm more or less I don't mention as my favorite to many other people. To the point that they can be more or less be considered my guilty pleasure. That being said, I know this might defeat the purpose, but why not list them here? So, that being said, it's time to count down my top 10 guilty pleasure anime. To be honest, for this list, we're taking a look at all the anime that I'm kind of ashamed that I like, either ashamed I like or don't really tend to mention that I like in a sort of casual conversation. Or rarely show my friends whenever I watch them. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. Starting off first, at number 10, we have Pekala. Yeah, surprisingly enough, we're starting this one off with an anime that I didn't even know was an anime. And surprisingly enough, I didn't even remember, I've kind of forgot about Pekala since back when I was a kid growing up in the early 2000s, I basically was introduced to this one when it debuted on Cartoon Network. And basically seeing a whole bunch of blocky animals in a town just living their own life, kind of like, well, what we see in the amazing world of Gumball just almost a decade or so down the road, it's really kind of funny and kind of nice to see, to say the least. That being said, it really does say a lot once you realize that around 2013, when my mom initially canceled cable, and we had to use rabbit ear TVs, I more or less rediscovered this on Cubo. Yeah, anyone remember that channel? And honestly, all the memories came flooding back. And surprisingly enough, I didn't realize a Canadian-Japanese show like this was considered anime. Which leads me to the reason why this is a guilty pleasure of mine. Anyone who either watched Cartoon Network or Cubo, they know this series, they basically see this series as a cartoon. They would have no idea that this was an anime. So basically, it's kind of interesting, sort of a little secret when you think about it. Which, again, really says a lot when it comes down to it. Plus, again, I'm kind of surprised about this one, but Michael Cera actually voiced a character in this anime. Yeah, that's right. Scott Pilgrim himself voiced Robbie Rabbit in Pekala. That's kind of wild. Moving on next at number 9, we have Excel Saga. Speaking of things that are kind of wild, Excel Saga was kind of one of those weird shows that I discovered while kind of flipping through TV channels, or specifically on demand, looking for something to watch. When I discovered it, I was like, this one's kind of interesting. And the very first episode I watched was, the first episode of the series, which showed Excel basically just skipping along after school before eventually getting hit and killed by Truck-kun. I was like, oh, what type of show is this? And then almost instantly, it just got into the main meat and potatoes of the series, with Excel basically being a loyal soldier of a sort of, I guess I'd say, alien dictator named Lord Il Palazzo. And basically, he basically is wanting to more or less carry out his plans for the entire Earth. And basically, it's just... And ever since then, it goes through many different episodes that parody specific anime. And honestly, or specific anime genres. And honestly, I was kind of surprised at the entire thing. And at the same time, I found it funny, which really does say a lot, considering many of the characters are kind of interesting to watch. And many of them have their own sort of idea, have their own sort of hilarity to them. Like the whole thing with Nabashin and the anthropomorphized version of the world, to the running gag of Hyatt dying in almost every episode, kind of bringing to mind Kenny from South Park, to even Menchie just more or less being seen as an emergency food stash by Excel. Which again brings to mind the whole dogs are friends, not food thing. Essentially, it's kind of hilarious. And this just leads to why it's a guilty pleasure. Because again, honestly, there's gonna be a lot of people who aren't gonna be as understanding, or there's most people that aren't gonna follow alongside this entire anime. And unless you've been able to watch a lot of South Park or Family Guy, you'd be able to understand it. Granted, that being said, I'm not sure how many out there have watched Excel Saga, but yeah, it's kind of a weird, trippy experience that you need to see for yourself. Really says a lot. Moving on next at number 8, we have... Is it wrong to pick up girls in a dungeon? Yeah. If you already hadn't guessed from my past videos, anything involving fantasy, I love. And granted, you'll soon see there's another anime that kind of takes place in a high fantasy world that I enjoy a lot. But of course, when it comes down to it, is it wrong to pick up girls in a dungeon? I first discovered, during the pandemic, like around 2020. And of course, I was kind of interested in it, as it's kind of a funny anime, or at least it was before then. But either way, it's kind of an interesting anime, as it follows alongside the character of Belle Cranell, who is joined by a goddess by the name of Hestia. And Belle basically wants to become a great adventurer, with a little help from Hestia, who wants to become a great goddess. And a lot of other wacky aspects to it. Also, the fact that Hestia is named after is basically the Greek goddess in anime girl form really says a lot. That being said, it's a guilty pleasure considering the recent state of the anime world, where people are being judged for liking specific anime that most people don't like. And yeah, I think it's most of the recent people that watched anime from 2020 who experienced this wouldn't basically like the high fantasy aspect, and they just kind of write it off as trash because of Hestia. Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's not a character, but it's just involving a character, but it really does say a lot. I wish the whole anime fandom thing was not the way it is. Moving on next, at number 7, we have Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal. Alright, I'm going to get this guilty pleasure thing out of the way, but when it comes down to it, the reason Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal is a guilty pleasure for me is because I rarely see anyone talking about this one, as most Yu-Gi-Oh! Fans will praise the original 3 Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, and Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Well, more or less dumping on Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. And honestly, I don't see it the same way as they do. I mean, I like the entire holographic VR setting of dueling, and honestly, the Xyz summoning thing, and the entirety of Xyz summoning, I really like. Just when it comes down to it, Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal kind of is a pariah with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Fandom. Granted, if we do get a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Series that's a little bit worse, maybe Zexal might end up getting a lot more love, but until then, Zexal's always going to be a guilty pleasure for me. Yeah. Moving on next, in number 6, we have You're Under Arrest. Speaking of anime, I basically discovered when I was flipping through the on-demand selection, back when Comcast and Xfinity had the on-demand, I basically discovered this series during my searches. And considering one thing about me is that I love police procedurals and crime dramas like CSI, Law and Order SVU, Castle, and even a new one like Copper. So I basically checked this series, the first episode of this series, out because I thought it was kind of like that. And while it does focus on 2 police officers who are kind of opposites of each other, it was kind of like a combination of The Odd Couple meets Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And don't get me wrong, I love Brooklyn Nine-Nine as well, from the episodes I saw of that show. But even with that, this series is kind of interesting, and it's a series I somewhat enjoyed. Granted, if I was going to... It's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, because if I was going to give anyone a chance of watching either this series or Brooklyn Nine-Nine, they're gonna choose Brooklyn Nine-Nine with its jokes and the fact that the late Andre Braugher's character does not like the word bone to watch over this anime. So, yeah. Really kind of a lose-lose situation here. This will be continued in part 2.